Are you drowning in DIY ingredients, swimming in sewing supplies, or have you ever gotten super excited about a new hobby, spent a bunch of money getting all of the gear and supplies to do it, only to give up after one try? No shame, you're not alone. In fact, one study in the UK found that the shelf life of a hobby is just 16 months. And 25% of people claim that they gave up a hobby without ever having used any of the items they purchased for it. That's a lot of yarn, paint, potential, and money, considering people spend hundreds on supplies on average, and it's all just collecting dust. Hey everyone, Amber from Sustainable Jungle, where we share sustainability tips, tricks, hacks, products, brands, and stories to better our planet. And today, we're diving into a topic that hits close to cluttered home for a lot of us. Those well-meaning hobbies that start with a bang and end up with a pile of unused supplies. They say you know you're an adult when you have that closet. You know the one. The one that's overflowing with a half-knit sweater, a dusty watercolor set, that guitar that you swore you'd learn how to play. We've all been there in some way or another. But here's the thing, hobbies don't have to be wasteful. And that's true for both seasoned crafters and hobbyists who have found their niche, and those of us who are just looking to try something new but aren't really sure if we'll like it. So today, I'm going to talk to you about low-waste hobbies, how to pick them, how to make them more sustainable, and how to avoid the trap of hobby waste altogether. But before we dive in, be sure to give us a like and a subscribe, and check the link in the description below for updates on our soon-to-launch membership portal on our website, where you can get access to exclusive content and perks. Now, I jokingly call myself a professional hobby collector. I embroider, I weave, I paint, I write, I hike, I garden, I raise quail, I upcycle clothing, I cook, I bake bread. The list kind of goes on. And most recently, this last winter, I got into pyrography and have absolutely been loving this challenging and really unforgiving new medium. The point is, I love doing stuff. I pretty much have to actually always be doing something. Just sitting and watching TV without something to keep my hands occupied, that is an utterly painful experience for me. And there is nothing more satisfying than doing and making something with my own two hands. It is so cathartic and soul-feeding for me personally. And you don't have to take my word for it. Plenty of other people agree. Based on a survey of over 200 people conducted just this year in February of 2025, 65.2% said that hobbies have helped their personal life. And in fact, science says that hobbies are good for the brain, period. Neuroscientist Kelly Lambert wrote an entire book about the power of doing things with your hands and how it stimulates the effort-driven reward circuit in the brain. And she also links a lack of hands-on physical activity to the onset of depression. Basically, our brains are programmed to derive satisfaction and pleasure when our physical effort produces something tangible, visible, and meaningful. And her research all started in the aftermath of her mother's death, when she discovered that the only thing that brought relief was vacuuming her house. So hobbies don't even have to be fun necessarily to be satisfying. Just doing something and creating something real has a profound impact. Other studies have looked at the usefulness of craft-based media for therapy and shown that craft-based interventions can provide at least short-term improvements in anxiety, stress, depression, interest in life, self-efficacy, social skills, sociability, mood, well-being, self-esteem, satisfaction, and other health-related quality of life aspects. And when we really vibe with one of our hobbies, they kind of become part of our identity. I mean, when I was really into rock climbing and pretty much did it full-time for like a year when I lived in the van and traveled around doing that, that was how I defined myself. I was a climber. And now, even though I've gradually moved away from that pursuit as I've gotten older and found that things hurt a lot more than they did when I was 20, I still consider embroidery and gardening to be huge parts of my identity. I mean, it would be more surprising if something that you didn't spend dozens of hours doing each month didn't intrinsically become part of how you see yourself. So what's the issue? I mean, having hobbies is clearly a very good thing, but trying hobbies very briefly and then abandoning them, not so good. Because while trying something new is awesome and something that we should definitely all do from time to time, the problem here is that many hobbies require startup gear and materials that we buy to even try to get into the hobby that then gets thrown away or sits collecting dust when the hobby is abandoned. So here are the facts. More people are crafting than ever before. The market size of the online hobby and craft supply sales in the US has grown at a 1.1% rate between 2019 and 2024. That may not sound like much, but over 1% per year in such a small gap is actually pretty significant. And rough estimates suggest that in the US, arts and craft supplies generated over 144 million pounds of waste in 2022 alone, much of which was non-recyclable due to mixed plastic packaging, synthetic materials, and contamination from glue, paint, glitter, all the things that we make things out of. And now granted, that number is approximated because the EPA's municipal solid waste reports don't get quite that specific when they're breaking down the different categories of waste, but it's pretty logical that if you think about all of the packaging with most of the supplies alone, you can see a lot of waste right there. And packaging aside, the supplies themselves often have a pretty significant impact. I mean, paints are often petroleum-based and chock full of chemicals. A lot of yarn is made of synthetic fabrics, particularly acrylic is the really common material. And let's not even talk about more complex gear like bikes and skis, if that's your kind of hobby niche, because those are going to contain all kinds of combined materials and components that make them virtually impossible to recycle at end of life. The point is, hobbies generate a lot of waste, which is especially tragic if we don't even stick with it, as many of us don't. In fact, 25% of people say they have given up a hobby having never used any of the things that they purchased specifically for it. Now, that's always a lot of waste of materials and also a huge waste of money, because I'm sure I don't need to tell you that many hobbies aren't cheap. One survey in the UK revealed that Brits spent a collective 117 million pounds on hobbies they haven't maintained since the pandemic. And a lot of us recognize this and maybe even feel ashamed of it, but it's such an easy trap to fall into, but it's also an easy trap to avoid falling into. So let's talk about that. Now, like I said, I have tried a lot of hobbies, and I actually stuck with a lot of the hobbies that I've tried. And so by now, I've kind of reached a point in my life where I've found that the ones that I know I'm pretty much going to be sticking with. And I won't lie and tell you that I haven't abandoned my fair share of hobbies in the past. I actually abandoned embroidery the first time I tried it many years ago. I found that embroidering classic flowers and, initials and all the things that you typically see to be so mind-numbingly boring. And it was 5 years later that I broke out all of my old floss that I had bought that first go around and kept stored in my mother's house. And I picked it back up with the realization that I didn't have to stick with just stitching flowers. I could stitch whatever I wanted. So I started embroidering things like this, like characters I loved, or this that I'm currently working on of musicians and people that I love. Whatever I wanted to, I realized that there wasn't any limitation. I could make it out of thread. And so now I have literally spent thousands and thousands of hours doing this over the last 3 years. So take that as a lesson that maybe it's not the hobby itself that you dislike, but the content that you're creating with it. But aside from making sure that you are making something that sparks joy, here are some more tips that you can try to mix things up and scratch that hobby itch without all of the waste and clutter. Number one is to start small and secondhand. So instead of splurging on new materials, try thrifting supplies or even borrowing from friends to just test the waters out. So before hitting the craft store, check out your local thrift stop or maybe a buy nothing group, because more often than not, the craft supply section of a thrift store actually is going to be bursting with all sorts of kinds of knickknacks. Granted, it is often really, really difficult to sort through and find anything that you're actually looking for, so don't go there necessarily looking to find something really specific. But a lot of times I always just check and see if there's things like embroidery hoops or cool colors of yarn or floss, which there almost always is. Art reuse stores are another option because those exist. Think thrift store, but specifically for art and craft supplies. And you can basically find everything from, a half-finished skein of yarn at a fraction of the price to half-used paints. Basically, they exist because of problems like this where people try hobbies and then they find out they didn't like it. And so these places have started where people can donate these materials to then get resold to somebody else who wants to try it out. And they divert tons of materials from landfills each year, and they offer supplies at a fraction of the cost. Now, the downside is that these are typically right now only found in bigger cities like Portland's Scrap, but it still doesn't hurt to search and see if there's one near you. And shopping secondhand goes double for hobbies like biking or skiing. The ones with a really high cost entry barrier. Now, sure, you are probably not going to score a really nice mountain bike or a set of G3 powder skis at your local Goodwill. But there are lots of outdoor consignment stores that specialize in those items specifically and usually carry high quality secondhand options that are still a steal when you consider the regular retail prices. I actually used to work in one. I even owned one of these for a while. So I've seen exactly how amazing this business model is for getting people geared up at a much more affordable price point. And I'm going to link to a resource down in the description below of a bunch of them that I have collected and listed around the US over the last few years. So you can see if there's one near you. Now that said, you might be able to rent these things too. Like you can rent bikes from many bike shops, and basically every ski resort I've ever been to has rental options if you're truly just trying something out. And maybe if you love skiing, but you only get the chance to go once or twice a year, it might not be worth spending, $1,000 to $2,000 on a ski setup, which is realistically on the lower end of what they cost these days. So rentals in this case are going to be a much more cost-effective option. And this also applies to a lot of different types of equipment. Maybe if you need a sewing machine, a camera, or a power drill, check out a local resource library if you have one, or a makerspace or tool lending programs before buying one yourself. Or even check local art centers to see if they have open studio nights. For instance, my local art center, and this is a pretty small town, so even really small towns can have these, but they have drop-in pottery nights where people can pay $10 to use the wheels and the kiln, and then there's clay and stuff that you can buy there and glazes and all that stuff. So it's a way more affordable way to give pottery a try without having to splurge on really big machinery. Number 3 is that you can host a hobby swap. So basically gather your friends and all of your unused supplies and trade them. Your abandoned crochet set might be someone else's next big passion. Number 4, how about a hobby that's not only therapeutic, but more likely to break down naturally at the end of its life? I'm talking about hobbies that utilize natural materials, like embroidery using cotton embroidery floss and cotton fabric, which by the way is the fabric you should be using anyway because you do not want stretch in your fabric on an embroidery hoop. And here's a bunch of other ideas. You could try basket weaving with reeds, whittling or spoon carving, pressed flower art with garden blooms that you've grown yourself, creating botanical dyes with things like avocado pits, onion skins, and turmeric, or even making your own herbal tinctures. I'm actually about to start a fresh batch of cottonwood oil tincture, which as you can see, this is last year's batch. So I do it at the beginning of the summer every year where I collect the cottonwood buds from my yard. When they're all sticky, that's when you ideally want to do it and annoying and sticking to your feet. Then you just submerge them in either olive or avocado oil for a number of months, strain out the solids, and then bam, you have a super easy skin healing salve. You can also mix it with beeswax to turn it into a balm. Or you can try recycled and upcycled projects, which basically means that your trash could be your next masterpiece. And upcycled hobbies are kind of the definition of turning lemons into lemon-scented candles. Literally. And this one, of course, has a very special place in my heart because it's literally what I have an entire business based on. Years ago, when we ran our used gear consignment store, we asked ourselves, what can we do when people bring in old climbing ropes? Because we obviously couldn't just resell them for safety purposes. So we started experimenting and making products and eventually closed our consignment store in favor of just focusing on the crafting business since it was becoming too much to do both. So you can try to adapt things like that into hobbies. So there's a lot of potential when it comes to upcycle crafting. Here's just a few other ideas to get your brains working. You could make candles with old jars and maybe even leftover wax. You could make paper from junk mail and old newspapers, weave rugs out of worn out old clothing strips, make mosaic art using broken pottery or glass, make denim patchwork from old jeans. You could make wall weavings from shorter yarn scraps. This one is actually especially great for knitters and crocheters who often have just little bits left over after larger projects. Number 6 is to try minimalist hobbies. And by minimalist, I mean those that require little to no extra stuff, like bird watching. Sure, a pair of binoculars might come in handy, but they're not necessarily required. Or digital drawing. Now, this does require either a drawing pad or a tablet like an iPad, but many people already own tablets, so if you're one of them and you have one, maybe try to use it to try your hand at creating digital drawings. If your device can support computer software rather than just apps, try the program Krita, which is a totally free open source drawing and painting program. Or yoga. Yoga is one of the few sport hobbies that requires little to no equipment. Yes, having your own mat can be nice, but if you opt for the yoga class route, they'll have mats there that you can use, and all the other yoga accessories like blocks and straps aren't exactly necessary. And yes, they can bolster, get it, your practice, but they're not required, and you can use what you have in place of them. For instance, if you're just getting started and you need a strap to help give you that additional reach on a stretch, see if you have a belt or even just a spare strip of fabric at home that will work. Folded blankets can replace bolster cushions, and even a stack of books can act in place as a bolster block for some poses. And finally, donate or sell supplies that you'll never use. If you have supplies that are hanging around from the ghost of Try Hobbies past, don't hoard them needlessly like Scrooge. Honestly ask yourself, will I ever use these again? If you're on the fence, the answer is probably no. So instead of letting it clutter your house, pass it on to someone who will use this. I actually just did this with a bunch of wool yarn that I was gifted and hung on to for years before finally admitting that I hated the colors and I was never going to use them. So I went on my embroidery Instagram, I put a call out to all of my knitting and crochet followers, said I'd give it to them for free if they just paid the shipping cost, and voila, it found a new home right away. If you don't care about recouping any cost, you can donate or give away items for free just like I did. If you don't know anyone personally who wants the stuff, check with local school art departments, daycares, things like that. Teachers almost always have woefully underfunded supply budgets and end up buying a lot of the things for their classroom themselves, so this is a huge help to them. Or maybe a school in your area is one of just 5% of US high schools that still offer home ec classes. Donate it to the teacher there. It might benefit a low-income student who can't afford to buy their own fabrics, as most home ec classes require. If you're a fiber artist, you can also check with local community theaters or college theater programs maybe, because their costume departments may definitely want those spare fabric scraps and buttons. For higher end gear and hobbies like biking, skiing, and maybe even climbing, there is a big resale market for this type of gear because it's so expensive. So if you have any of those, you can check if there's local gear consignment shops near you, or you can use an online service like Gear Trade, which is basically just eBay specifically for outdoor gear and clothing. So in the end, low-waste hobbies aren't about being perfect, they're just about being intentional, like everything in sustainable living. So whether you're painting, whittling, or mountain biking, just remember, the most sustainable hobby is one that you actually do and do mindfully. And remember, a little pause at the beginning can save you a heap of waste later. So avoid the dreaded hobby graveyard and ask yourself, do I have space for this hobby? Will I realistically stick with it? Can I borrow or rent before I buy? Can I use what I already have? Now, if you like this video, please hit that like button and subscribe for more ways to live sustainably without sacrificing the joy. And tell me in the comments, what is your favorite low-waste hobby? Or what tips do you have to share for making whatever your hobby is a little bit less impactful? Share the sustainable hobby know-how to bring joy without the junk. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't. And this is Amber from Sustainable Jungle, wishing you a wonderful day.